Kerby Anderson.
Thank you for joining me today here on Point of View. If you would like to join our conversation over the next couple of hours, feel free to give us a call, 1-800-351-1212. If you'd like to watch the program, of course, you can watch it by going to pointofview.net and also on Facebook Live. And if you want to leave a comment there, I will pick that up as well. I know some people say, well, I'd like to leave a comment, but I really don't want to call and wait online and then say something on the air. But if you have some comments, we'll certainly appreciate that as well. Going to cover a lot of issues in the news today. Let me just give you an advance preview of something that will happen in the third hour. John Stonestreet will be with us. He is the co-author of a book called Life, Marriage, and Religious Liberty. And really, it was on the 10th anniversary of the so-called Manhattan Declaration that this book came out, and he is one of the co-authors with David Dockery. And so we'll talk with him a little bit about that, but also talk about what's going on there at Breakpoint. They have a new program that they have just invented. What would you say? It's a video program, so we'll talk about that. He has some comments about the gay gene. I've even posted that particular Breakpoint commentary there, so I think we'll talk about that. And before the hour is over, since he loves to talk about all these issues, he and Eric Metaxas have done quite a bit cataloging some of these new archaeological finds. Some of those I've mentioned on the air. Many of those are not even in our archaeology booklet that I make available to you, but we probably will put some of those together in the future. So we'll cover lots of topics, as we always do with that individual. But before then, we have some opportunities to look at a couple of issues. And since this particular hour, the primary listeners to this hour from 12 to 1 are in the state of Texas. And even if you're in Minnesota and Nevada, a number of other places where you're listening to this, I want to come back to the shooting in Midland, Odessa. We mentioned it yesterday, but since that time, we've seen some comments by the governor of the state of Texas, the lieutenant governor of the state of Texas, and I thought it would be worthwhile covering in our so-called Texas Hour, but even so, I've heard people on national programs mention this as well. And if nothing else, there is going to be a lot of pressure on the legislature as well as pressure on our federal government to do something. And, of course, when you talk about the fact that this was the fourth mass shooting in Texas in 4 years, you've had some comments by the governor and the lieutenant governor about this. So I do want to talk about that. And if nothing else, kind of take you through the various steps of what, since a lot of people are talking about universal background checks, what that might mean. And if nothing else, maybe pull some things from yesterday's conversation that were said off air. I've jokingly said more than once, we should leave sometimes the microphones on because some of the conversation in the first hour yesterday between me and Nick Pitts and between me and Ivy Nichols was very interesting. So I want to take you through that. I won't violate any of the confidences, but I will mention some of the questions they were asking and some of the response because we were off air talking about some of the things that I want to talk about on air. And so we'll get into this whole issue of shooting and gun violence, federal gun policies, and that a little bit later. And I may wait to really get into some of this in the next hour, talking about the whole issue of Hurricane Dorian and how many people are saying that this is a classic illustration of climate change. And I thought it was kind of interesting because one of the articles I posted here said, well, yeah, it's climate change because climate changes, but that's not what people mean. They mean because we have people burning coal-fired plants to get electricity, because we have people driving around in SUVs, the climate is getting hotter. And so as a result, that's making the warm water more violent, and that is giving us more hurricanes and more intense hurricanes, all of which, by the way, are not true. But we will get to that later. And then I do want to maybe say something before we get to John Stonestreet in the third hour about Donald Trump and the impact of the trade wars and what that might mean to you and your family. And I've got a very good piece here, which we didn't post. I may think about whether we want to post it later, by Ben Shapiro, in which he gives us a little bit of the history of Elizabeth Warren. And I was totally unaware that many years ago, I'm talking about almost 20 years ago, a little less than that, maybe 15 years ago, Elizabeth Warren, who at that time was a professor at Harvard and kind of having a best-selling book, which was called The Two-Income Trap, was actually saying the kinds of things that you would expect Penna Dexter to say in our Friday weekend edition, or even as she sits in this table hosting the program, and how she has moved from a person who I think understood some of the problems that were created by dual income families and by government and by a market that reacted, I think, understandably to a dual income family, and as a result raised the prices of houses, because now you could use both incomes of the husband and the wife to actually pay for that particular mortgage. Thus, it made it much easier to raise the prices of those houses. Also, some of that had to do with just supply and demand. You had this baby boom, which then came into the house buying years. You had more people wanting to buy houses than houses, so that raised the price as well. But there were all sorts of things that Elizabeth Warren was saying, and I'll just say 15 years ago in the early 2000s, that we would probably around this table probably agree with. And now you look at the things that Elizabeth Warren is saying in order to get the nomination, and he makes the case that Elizabeth Warren in 2003, 2004 would probably be elected president, but the Elizabeth Warren of 2019 and 2020 would actually vilify the Elizabeth Warren of 2003, 2004. So we'll get into some of that a little bit later, because I thought it would be just an illustration again that as you begin to seek power, especially in the Democrat Party, you have to throw off a lot of ideas that you used to hold to. A good example of that, for those of us that are a little bit older, remember that many of the people that ran for the presidency, say in the 1980s and even the 1990s, had before been kind of pro-life individuals, but they recognized very early on that you are not going to win the nomination to the Democrat Party if you want to run for the presidency if you believe in pro-life issues, so that got thrown off pretty quickly. And as a result, we also have noticed in the last 20 years, various candidates recognizing that they had to sometimes say that they still believed in traditional marriage until they felt that it was safe to then come out in favor of same-sex marriage, and then now even to embrace everything on the LGBTQ agenda. So we've seen this before, so it isn't really a surprise, but it is kind of striking that Ben Shapiro documents this remarkable change in Elizabeth Warren and the kind of radical ideas that she is espousing now compared to some almost common sense kinds of recommendations she was making 15 years ago. So we'll get into that as well. But when we come back from the break, I want to talk about the Odessa shooter, the individual that failed a previous background check. And as a result, is that a loophole? Does that mean we need to have comprehensive and universal background checks? So we'll talk about that right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
You know, teenagers are sending sexually explicit images and videos to each other at an alarming rate. That is the conclusion of a study posted recently in the journal Pediatrics. The journal article, Prevalence of Multiple Forms of Sexting Behavior Among Youth, is a meta-analysis of 39 worldwide studies that included 110,000 participants. They found that sexting is more common than most parents would even imagine. The studies focused on teens between the ages of 12 and 17. The researchers estimated about 1 in 7 kids sent sexting messages and more than 1 in 4 received them. The authors suggest that the discrepancy in these numbers is due to the fact that some teens send sexting messages to multiple people. Now, one of the conclusions of the study is something that you would probably already know if you talk to any teenagers. They found the girls are often pressured by boys to send a sexually explicit photo. I sit on a board with an adolescent psychologist who often asks a teenage girl why she sends a photo. The answer is always the same. She was pressured to do so. Parents need to communicate lots of things to their children in light of this new research finding. First, we should remind them of the permanence of these images. They may think they're sending these pictures and videos to a trusted friend, but we hear so many stories about images that were then passed on to others. Then these images are passed on again. Soon these sexually explicit images can be found all over the internet. Second, we should tell kids never to send a sexting message to anyone, but we also need to tell them not to ask for them. The research shows that boys are 4 times more likely to pressure girls to send sexting messages. Parents need to talk to their daughters and their sons. Sexting is more common than we would ever have imagined. That's why parents need to get involved. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
Take Kerby and the Point of View team with you on the go with the Point of View app. Search for Point of View Radio at the Apple or Google Play stores.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Okay, let's get to this issue of universal background checks. And a lot of that is stimulated by the fact that we had a 36-year-old man fatally shot 7 people and wounded 22 others. And that, because it's in the news, has put even more pressure on the Texas legislature, on the governor, on the lieutenant governor, and various members of the legislature to do something. Also put pressure on members of Congress to do something, and that's all due to the press reports of 7 people killed, 22 wounded. But what is missing is the other press report of 8 people killed and 35 wounded. Where did that happen? Well, that happened last weekend in Chicago, which got no coverage at all. I looked in vain and only found one link to that. And so again, let's be honest that when we talk about these issues of shootings, yes, this was one individual that killed that many. In Chicago, it was a number of individuals, but it just illustrates again, when we get to these facts and these figures, it's important to put everything on the table. That being said, I wasn't even going to cover this today until I started seeing all the things that the governor, Greg Abbott, has been saying and the Lieutenant Governor, Dan Patrick, has been saying. So I thought we would cover some of this. This comes from the Texas Tribune, in which they said that details of how the rifle was purchased came a day after the governor, Greg Abbott, said that the shooter previously failed a gun purchase background check. I went back and checked that. That indeed did take place. A DPS spokesman said that he did. This individual, who I never mention, although I know what his name is, and maybe I should at least mention his first name so it doesn't get too confusing. His first name is Seth, okay? So Seth, in 2014, failed a background check. And because you fail a background check, unless you go and fix it, then any other time you want to buy a gun, you actually are going to be routinely and automatically declined. Now, before I go any further, let me point out, having done this myself and also having talked to people, sometimes you get what's called a false positive. In other words, they say you have a criminal history. Or if you want to look at it the other way, a false negative, that is, I'm not going to let you buy a gun. However you want to say that, I'll call it a false positive. And so then you have the opportunity to clear that up, so that then it turns out that you were confused with another guy by the name of Seth, for example. But he did not. So as a result, he could not purchase a gun. He could not go to Cabela's. He could not go to even Walmart, which is now kind of dropping those opportunities. He could not go to Bass Pro Shop, wherever you might want to go to buy a gun. Any place that sells guns, does a background check, would decline him. So how did he get a gun? A private sale.
And that's what caused some people to say, maybe we need to look at this issue of a universal background check. Up until now, most of the shooters were able to obtain guns legally or obtained them inadvertently through someone who obtained them legally. Let's go back to the Newtown, Connecticut shooting. This very deranged young man takes his mother's gun, which was obtained legally in the state of Connecticut, kills her, and then goes into the elementary school and kills other individuals. You can't come up with a way in which even a background check in that case would have worked. When you look at some of these other shootings, let's take California. Gilroy, California is a good example because just a few minutes ago, I was thinking about a conversation I've had with people in the past who have simply said, well, we just need to have more strict gun regulations. And I point out, in the state of California, if you look at 50 states, the one at the very top that has the most restrictive gun regulations is California. By the way, Connecticut's in the top 3. Okay. What else would you do if this person obtained legally that gun that he used to kill those people in Gilroy, California? Anyway, I digress. In this particular case, now we have an example that I think will be used many times to say this is why we need a universal background check, that when an individual purchases a gun, even when it's a private sale, not from a gun shop, you should do a background check. And so that's why you had the lieutenant governor said that he thought there should be a strong look at the lack of required background checks for some private sales. Here's his direct quote. I believe as a supporter of the Second Amendment, we should protect that family transfer or family sale, but any stranger to stranger, we don't know how this person got the gun, but we know that it's a real loophole in the law, and I think the NRA, which would be the National Rifle Association, needs to get behind the president on that issue and really address this issue. So here is an individual, Lieutenant Governor of the state of Texas, strong supporter of the Second Amendment, probably received funds from the NRA when he ran for election and re-election. Greg Abbott, governor, saying this. So again, the argument that you would see people making is that what we need to do is have universal background checks. Okay, well, now let's think this through for just a minute. This brings us to some of the conversation that took place when the microphones were off yesterday. At one point, I think it was Ivy Nichols said, well, why would there be a problem with the universal background check? And I said, well, the first question I would have is, you know, each one of my daughters has one gun. Now, they store them right now in my gun safe, but every once in a while they're going out shooting, and my oldest daughter is kind of like, well, I'm not really sure I want that. So if she wants to, quote, sell me or give me the gun, if indeed this was the case, I'd have to go through a background check to get my daughter's gun. And she said, well, maybe we could make an exception, which is exactly, of course, what the lieutenant governor said, of a family transfer or family sale. Yes, but, you know, if you really want to be complete, everybody should do that because, after all, you know, I might want to transfer it to my nephew or my son, and he really shouldn't have that, and I would want to do a background check on him. But, okay, some people say maybe that would be an exception to the rule. So that was the first issue that was raised, and I said, okay, well, let's just go down this road a little further because if you want to find my commentary that came out just last week on August 28th, I pointed out that, first of all, in order for a universal background check to really work, you would have to then have some kind of registry, because otherwise, how would you enforce it? If all you simply said is every time you sell a gun, you have to get a background check, well, how would I enforce it? Because you'd never be able to prove that you did that if that gun was used in the commission of a crime. Well, then that brings me to the conversation I had with Nick. Again, all the microphones are off, but I thought he was saying, well, what would be the problem? Maybe it wouldn't be the federal government, but maybe the states could have it. And I said, well, people are saying maybe it could be a state or even it could be an independent entity. But again, let's think that through. I said, what chance do you think that that information would remain secure? All of you in the listening audience that have ever had your identity compromised, or you know somebody who's had their identity compromised, raise your hand. If your hand's still not up, how many of you have had a credit card issued to you because the other credit card had been compromised by somebody who was able to hack into it. Well, of course, we've all lived in that world. And it's real easy to imagine that if there is a database that has gun registry, somebody who is going to be anti-Second Amendment or pro-gun control, they're going to want to go in there and they want to find that, although individuals that actually have those guns. And then they may even want to dox them. You know what that is? That's where we give out a person's home phone number. We give out their address. And you could see that they could post online every person that owns a gun in a neighborhood and every person, what guns they own in that neighborhood. Can you see where that goes? And then, of course, there are two individuals that would benefit from this. One would be the burglars who have been in especially the state of Texas wanting to know which particular homes are the safest to rob. Because as I pointed out to some of our people around the table, when you break in a back door into a home in the state of Texas, you are never quite sure if there's a person on the other side of that door that he or she is holding a gun in their hands. You can be relatively sure in New York or California or Connecticut, they probably don't. But in Texas, you're never sure. But if you knew the homes that did not have a gun, that, of course, would be the place where you would be more likely to break in because you would know that there is less likely that if you have a gun in your hand, that there would be any kind of competing force against you. Of course, the other part of that is some of the other criminals that were needing a gun would know that you have a gun in that house. And maybe if they break in and they have a safe, well, unless they're really good safe hackers, they couldn't. But let's face it, a lot of good old boys just put a shotgun under their bed so they could find it as well. So you can see, as we start down this road of universal background checks, there are a lot of questions. And I've already raised some, and I'm sure there are others I haven't even thought about, but it just illustrates again what's in store for members of Congress and even legislators in the state of Texas. We'll take a break. We've got a lot more to cover, and we will do that right after this.
Point of View is committed to spreading the truth, oftentimes a truth that those in political power don't like getting heard. But the only way it can be heard is if our team stands strong together, if you do what you can to support the Point of View Truth Team. It's having an impact, as we heard recently from U.S. Representative Louis Gohmert.
Everywhere I go, I hear people that you have influenced, that Point of View has affected. You have made such a difference, and you rely on people to contribute, and if they don't contribute, then that truth does not get heard.
Help Point of View make a difference. Pray and consider what level is right for you. $30, $65, $100 a month, or even more. Please do what you can. 1-800-347-5151. Or visit online, pointofview.net. Look near the top right for the link that says Become a Monthly Partner. Join the Truth Team. 800-347-5151 and pointofview.net. Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Back once again, if you'd like to join our conversation, that number is 1-800-351-1212. I just checked our Facebook page there. If you'd like to leave a comment, you can do so as well. And I am going to move on in just a few minutes to some other topics, but while I'm on it, let me just mention and bring to conclusion some of this. First of all, Governor Greg Abbott and Lieutenant Governor Dan Patrick have both said maybe what we need to do is study this. And so they said they, first of all, were working on a legislative package that would have expedited executions for mass murderers. And then, of course, you've had some people arguing against that anyway, and I don't see that that even is going to allow that to happen. But nevertheless, that's the suggestion being made there. Also, you have the lieutenant governor, who is essentially the head of the Senate, and the Speaker of the House, Dennis Bonnen, announced that they would form a special legislative committee to find ways to prevent mass violence. We'll see where that takes us, but that gives you a little bit of the Texas flair. One of the things I thought I'd also quote from is John Stonestreet. He has this piece called Mass Shootings Cause Mass Delusions, and he starts out by saying, even as violent crime has fallen greatly since the 1970s and 80s, Americans have been forced to process a hideous innovation. That is the widespread nihilistic mass killings that have increased in frequency, feeding each off each other. First of all, let me just point out that something he says there might catch you off guard, and that is, first of all, when you look at the violent crime rate, it has dropped significantly since the 1980s and 1990s. But more than that, when you look at even gun violence, it has dropped as well. My April 19th commentary actually is quoting from the Washington Post, which is hardly kind of a pro-Second Amendment kind of organ, but nevertheless warned that most Americans incorrectly think that gun murder rates have gotten worse, not better. And as a matter of fact, the group that probably is most biased in that regard, most off base, probably a better way to say it, would be the suburban and small town women who, interestingly enough, believe that the murder rate has gone up or that it's significant when it actually has gone down. As a matter of fact, if you want to look at that, the murder rate between even 1995 and 2017 has dropped by almost half. That's surprising to most individuals. As a matter of fact, a lot of people that have read this piece go, "Are you sure about that?" And I said, well, yeah. I mean, first of all, the Washington Post is not making those numbers up. They get those numbers from FBI, get those numbers from the CDC. And by the way, I might even mention the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, even though they keep statistics mostly on disease, they also keep statistics on guns. And, of course, what they point out is something else that never really gets reported very often, and that is most of these areas of gun violence actually have to do with suicides. You can pick any year. Go to the CDC yourself. You don't have to believe what I'm saying. Check it out for yourself. You can go to the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention website, look under gun violence, and then look at gun suicides and gun homicides. And in almost any year you pick, gun suicides outnumber gun homicides, sometimes as much as 2-to-1. So when you hear this number of gun violence, you need to take at least 2/3 of those off due to suicide. Now, again, some of the people that want to have gun control say we need to remove those out of the hands of individuals that would kill themselves by using guns. Well, I hate to tell you, but they'll just find someone else to do so. But nevertheless, let's go back to this piece by John Stonestreet, because he points out that President Trump was prudent, and he says even statesmanlike in stating frankly on Saturday that no system of background checks for guns would have weeded out most of the mass killers in recent years. True. It might have actually made a difference in the shooter at Sutherland Springs if that had been a more effective system, and it certainly could have been used if we had universal background checks for the shooter in Midland. But he says then, John Stonestreet says, let's say we confiscated every non-police or military-style gun in the country. He said young men committed to dying in the process of murdering others wouldn't be deterred by the absence of guns. And He uses Timothy McVeigh in Oklahoma City and a variety of others. And so he points out that, part of the problem is if you really want to deal with mass killings, you're going to have to very significantly constrain liberty. And the example he uses is after 9/11, there was the idea that was put forward by people around President Bush that we could have the FBI infiltrate nearly every mosque in the country. And as a result, this would have an opportunity to ferret out individuals who might have radical ideas. But President Bush and the Bush administration decided that the price would be too high in terms of religious freedom. And so, and as a matter of fact, he then goes on to say they even bent over backwards after 9/11 to convey the dubiously truthful message that Islam is a religion of peace. But the point he's making is yes, there are ways to possibly deal with mass shooting, but at such a price to our liberty, would the American people, more or less, would even the ACLU, as much as they would like some of that to be done to eliminate gun violence, would they even go along with this? And then, as John Stonestreet is wont to do, he takes on one of those other myths that's out there, which has been repeated even in front of this microphone sometimes as well. And it certainly has been repeated a lot by the former member of Congress and presidential candidate Robert Beto O'Rourke, that actually people that are here illegally are not guilty of as many crimes as a percentage as the rest of the population. Well, again, John Stonestreet takes the time to go from the U.S. Sentencing Commission that shows those who were convicted of federal crimes, and he's looking at a period from 2011-2016. 44% were not U.S. citizens, 21% if immigration crimes are excluded. And so then talks about when you start looking at this, the number of non-citizens in this survey is about 8.4% of the adult population. But nevertheless, 42% of all the kidnapping convictions from non-citizens, 31% drug convictions, almost 23% of money laundering convictions from non-citizens, 13% of administrative justice offenses, that'd be witnessing, tampering, obstruction, contempt, 17%, almost 18% of economic crimes, that's larceny, embezzlement, 13% of other convictions, and on and on. And so he begins to help us understand that if we're going to talk about shootings, gun violence, and the rest, and we talk about the kinds of crimes that are being permitted, he, even though he was talking about the idea of mass shootings, because he's written a book on the issue of immigration, helps us understand that as well. One of the other conversations we had off air, and I thought I'd mention it on air, is this idea that, well, we need to do universal background checks because this will prevent mass shootings. And one of the arguments I have made is that if you look at the data, and certainly a man by the name of John Lott, Dr. John Lott, who is a professor at University of Chicago and at Yale and other places, has actually looked at all the different policies and proposals put forward by the Brady campaign and others. He has concluded that not one of those but one would have made any difference in any of these shootings. So what's the one? Whether or not that particular state has a concealed carry policy or rule or not. And you might say, well, yeah, but that's John Lott. Who knows? He might be supported by the gun manufacturers. He's not. But the bottom line is, okay, you don't have to necessarily believe him, even though he's a very well-respected professor at Ivy League schools. How about this? The RAND Corporation, which is definitely a left-of-center kind of organization. I've got this particular summary. You can read the entire one, but do you want to read no, you don't want to. You just want the summary. And here, what they actually conclude is they have found no qualifying studies showing that any of the 13 policies we investigated increased mass shootings, and we also found no qualifying studies showing that any of the 13 policies we investigated decreased mass shootings. And so basically they had background checks, bans on the sale of assault weapons, bans on high-capacity magazines, child access prevention laws, concealed carry laws, which, interesting enough, they didn't see any significance. John Lott did. Licensing and permitting regulations. Then they had some others that they looked at but didn't say they met their criteria, like their stand your ground laws, gun-free zones, and a variety of others. So whether it was John Lott, who, to be fair, probably fits more in the conservative category, or the RAND Corporation, or the Centers for Disease Control, who in many cases might have people that are more left of center in terms of their perspective, neither of them came to the conclusion that these kind of policies would make any difference. Something to think about as our legislators get together and as members of Congress consider what to do in the future. We'll be back right after this.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back for a few more minutes. Let me just mention, next hour we're going to get into a couple of other issues. First of all, what about the China trade policies that seems to be hurting manufacturing? But one of the individuals we've talked about and even interviewed once on this program has come out and supported what the president is doing because he's from China. He's the blind activist, which we will talk about a little bit later. He's a human rights activist and is certainly supporting what the president's been doing with China. So I'll give you kind of a counterpoint on that. We'll come back a little bit later to the idea of mass shootings and mass delusions, but also because, of course, the hurricane. Going to talk about this idea of global warming. And, of course, I have mentioned the conversation we're going to have about one of the odds-on favorites right now for becoming the next Democratic presidential candidate running against Donald Trump, and that would be Elizabeth Warren. So we have a lot more to cover. And don't forget, in the third hour. Even if you are on a radio station that cannot hear this, you can certainly watch it or hear it on our program, either on Facebook Live or at pointofview.net. But I thought I'd very quickly bring up a story that we just briefly mentioned last Friday, but it's worth getting into in a little more detail since we are going to be talking about the presidential election this year. And that is a decision that came down from what's called the 10th Circuit Court of Appeals. This is in Colorado. And it goes back to in 2016. You may know that when you elect a president, you really are not electing the president. You're electing your electors who will go to your state capital and cast their votes for that individual. Now, there's really an attempt to disrupt that by saying that in the future we may have a popular vote where those individuals will go to the state capital and not cast their vote based upon who won the state election, but who won the popular vote. That hasn't happened yet, but that could happen in the future. But you every once in a while have what's called a faithless elector. And in Colorado, you had one of these individuals that went to the state capitol there in Colorado, in Denver, and crossed out the name Hillary Clinton and wrote in the name John Kasich, who at that time was the Republican governor of Ohio. Well, the Colorado Secretary of State removed him and brought in another elector who voted for Clinton so that she received all the electoral votes from the state of Colorado. But the 10th Circuit Court of Appeals ruled can't do that. They said once the electors are chosen and report to their state capital, they cannot be removed, nor can the state nullify their votes. Now, in the past, the court has ruled in previous rulings that a state can bind the electors, but these laws, by the way, are pretty weak, and the penalties are pretty nominal. And we've had some examples over time where individuals have cast votes for, George Wallace and a variety of others. We can go through that long list of the few, and it never has made a difference. The difference is we are in really close elections, and you might even remember last time when there was a real campaign on the part of the Democrats to get some of these people that were supposed to vote for Donald Trump to actually vote for Hillary Clinton as the electors. Now, that never really happened, but you can kind of see where it takes you. And so as a result, you have Colorado saying that you cannot tell an individual how they can vote because once they've been selected, you cannot remove them, nor can you nullify their vote. Now, that contradicts, interestingly enough, the state of Washington, which ruled a while back in their state Supreme Court that electors must follow the results of the popular vote within the state. So now you have conflicting rulings. And if you've listened to our conversations we have so often here on Friday, what that means is the Supreme Court probably is going to have to step in. But again, the Supreme Court moves slowly. The Supreme Court would have to take these cases almost immediately when they convene in October and resolve those before they leave in June. There may be enough time, but it's also quite possible they might not rule by that time in the 2020 election. And, of course, if they do take up the case, which is a possibility, I just know that some of these justices are going to also talk about the Electoral College, because what we're starting to see now is while these cases are making their way through the courts, there's also been a real attempt to try to remove the Electoral College and to criticize that. Probably one of the best known for people in the pop culture. If you have an Instagram site, you can see Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, and she's got this little video. She's going through the farmland, and she, in a voice of really dripping with sarcasm, many votes here, you can see. The implication is this is a stupid way to elect a president by giving votes to people out here in the farmland. And then, of course, she also makes the case that the Electoral College is racist because what it does is it provides an advantage to white people, which in one of my commentaries coming out next week actually is just the opposite of what a lot of civil rights leaders have said. Let me just take one example. Civil rights leader Vernon Jordan argued that if you take away the Electoral College, the black vote means very little. And I'll quote from him. He says, the Electoral College puts the importance on the black vote, and if you remove it, the black vote melts away. He goes on to say blacks, instead of being crucial to victory in major states, simply become 10% of the total electorate with reduced impact. And there's a new book out by Tara Ross. Maybe we can get her on sometime. The Indispensable Electoral College, How the Founders' Plan Saves Our Country from Mob Rule, which he points out that the plan put together by the founders protects African Americans, Latinos, farmers, small states, all sorts of individuals. So the argument is being used now that, yeah, but that's not the way it happens in a city. And so enter Chris Hayes, who has been lately saying that the Electoral College would be unconstitutional if it weren't for the fact that it's in the Constitution. Okay, follow me on this one. He says, first of all, we believe in one man, one vote, and that's not the case. You know, we don't believe in one man, one vote for the Senate either, right? You know, Senate, you get 2 senators if you're from Delaware or Montana or Wyoming, or if you're from California, Texas, or New York, right? But nevertheless, he uses the example, which I just smile at. Imagine a city that has 60% black and 40% white. Then the city was divided into 4 voting districts that put the entire black population in one district. A majority black city is run by a majority white government. Okay, let's first of all leave aside the obvious. I can't think of a city in the country where that's the case. So first of all, it's really hilarious to even use that as an illustration. But, okay, let's set that argument aside. The bigger problem with his argument is it has nothing to do with the Electoral College. It has a lot to do with gerrymandering that sometimes takes place and has been used by parties on both sides, but especially by the Democrat Party in California right now to prevent a number of conservatives and Republicans from winning in places like Orange County, which are always been bastions for Republican support. But again, it's a good illustration of gerrymandering, but it's not an illustration or an argument against the Electoral College. So nevertheless, we can sit here and hear these arguments, and maybe we'll have some of this conversation on Friday with Jeremy Dice, because it is interesting. We've got some cases that now might go to the Supreme Court about the Electoral College and whether that would be used to have a narrow decision about a faithless elector or a broader decision about the Electoral College, maybe even a decision about the so-called popular vote in the Electoral College. So we'll see where that goes, and maybe we'll have that conversation on Friday. But I thought I'd give you a preview of what we might talk about on Friday, and also a preview of 2 of my commentaries that will be out next week. And if you have never signed up to receive my Viewpoint commentaries, today is on sexting more common. And if that's something of interest, you can certainly go to our website, pointofview.net, and print that out and read it. But there's also a place, if you hit read now, or even a section on looking at others, where you can sign up. Never miss a Viewpoint. Sign up here, and it is free, and we will send it to your inbox. Mine come to your inbox Monday through Friday. Penedexter's commentary, which he writes once a week, comes to your inbox on Saturday. So let me encourage you to sign up to receive those Viewpoint commentaries. When we come back, we have a lot more to cover, and we will do so right after this.
We live in a digital generation. Point of View is reaching this often overly plugged-in generation with truth. You can keep up with us 24 hours a day using your phone, your tablet, your laptop, or your desktop. Search for the Point of View Radio Talk Show on Facebook, where you can keep up with today's issues, learn about current and upcoming guests by liking us on Facebook. Also, follow us on Twitter. Our handle is @Point of View RTS. That stands for Point of View Radio Talk Show. Learn, interact, make a difference with Point of View using new media. And here's one way you can make a big difference. Help us increase our reach by spreading the word among your friends. Share a Facebook post. Tag us in a tweet. With enough joining us to plant seeds, we'll see a tremendous harvest. Come on, it only takes a minute. Search for Point of View Radio Talk Show on Facebook, @Point of View RTS on Twitter, and subscribe to the Point of View Radio Talk Show channel on YouTube. Learn, interact, share. The Point of View Radio Talk Show. Point of View will continue after this.
I just want to thank you so much for all the wonderful programming you have. You're just absolutely fantastic.
I recently started listening to Point of View, and I really found it interesting because of the different subjects you cover. Thank you for that.
I really appreciate everything that you do in keeping us informed.
Thank you, Kerby, for everything that you have been doing. I appreciate all the work that you're doing, advocating for the Word of God. Thank you so much.
Point of view, I think, is absolutely necessary because it's a Christian perspective, a biblical worldview perspective, and receive very current, up-to-date information about what is really going on, week to week in our culture, which is changing so rapidly, and yet it's morally sliding backwards.
Yeah, I'm just, first of all, I thank you guys. Y'all's program is wonderful, and enjoy it every day. I learn so much every time I listen to it.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.
Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging: apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View starts right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Thank you for joining me today. We're going to cover a lot of topics in the next couple of hours, so I hope you'll stay with us. We're going to move from topic to topic, and of course, if you would like to join our conversation at any point, give us a call. That number is 1-800-351-1212. Going to look at Hurricane Dorian and also this issue of climate change. We kind of mentioned that yesterday, but I've actually posted a piece by an individual that has worked in the area of climatology and meteorology for many years. Individual that graduated from England but actually works in India. And so I wanted you to read that piece called High Hurricanes and Climate Change Alarmism. And so we'll get into that. Some interesting statements being made about the China trade policies. Individuals that have come out saying that this is still a very good idea, though it is, as I will also point out, harming manufacturing right now. That is one of the editorials from the Wall Street Journal, so we'll cover that as well. A piece that I will talk about a little bit later this hour by Ben Shapiro on the remarkable change of Elizabeth Warren, who is beginning to surface as possibly the individual that will be the Democrat nominee running against Donald Trump, although it is still too early to say, and all of this, of course, depends on how the voters react starting next year, but certainly would like to talk about that for just a minute, because he reminds us that about 15 years ago when he first met Elizabeth Warren, who at that time was a professor at Harvard Law School, she had just published a best-selling book called The Two-Income Trap, as she identified some of the problems associated with those individuals that were actually in some cases filing bankruptcy in the middle class. She pointed out that some of the problems are actually the kinds of things that Penna Dexter sometimes talks about when we have our Friday weekend edition, or she talks about when she sits in this host chair. So it has been interesting to see the remarkable change in some issues between Elizabeth Warren of 2003 and 2004 and Elizabeth Warren in 2019, 2020. Matter of fact, he ends that by saying she would possibly be the president of the United States if she was the Elizabeth Warren of 2003 or 2004. She will not be, perhaps this time, and the current Elizabeth Warren would be very critical of the Elizabeth Warren of 15 years ago. So it's kind of an interesting little piece, so we'll talk about that. And then we'll also get into this issue of two articles I've posted, one on a serious gun crime proposal, Kevin Williamson, and then also the issue of mass shootings and mass delusions by our friend John Smirek. So we'll get into all of this if we can in the first hour. The second hour is reserved for our good friend John Stonestreet, who, of course, is one of the individuals that does the Breakpoint commentary. Also, they have been producing now a new video series called What Would You Say?, which I think is going to be really helpful on learning how to answer some of the tough questions that are surfacing. And, of course, a while back actually co-authored a book with David Dockery, Life, Marriage, and Religious Liberty, on the 10th anniversary of the Manhattan Declaration. So we'll spend some time talking about that with him. And before the hour is up, I'm hoping maybe we'll get into a little bit on archaeology. He loves archaeology, so do I, and it certainly is just interesting that so many times Eric Metaxas or John Stonestreet, doing the Breakpoint commentary, have talked about some of these incredible new archaeological finds that once again confirm the historical accuracy of the Bible. So if we haven't covered enough issues in 2 hours, well, just listen again tomorrow because we'll cover some more of those. But we're going to try to get into as many topics as possible. First of all, our prayers are really out to those, especially in the Bahamas, but even now on the eastern seaboard, affected by and devastated in some cases by Hurricane Dorian. But I also want to take on this argument that keeps being made that because of climate change, the hurricanes are increasing in frequency and intensity. No, they're not. And if you were listening yesterday, I held up a chart which actually is associated with my October 2nd, 2018 commentary on hurricanes and climate. And if you happen to be watching online, you will notice that if you look at the number of hurricanes, whether they're Cat 5 all the way down to Cat 1, Category 1 to 5, you see, if anything, the number of hurricanes are decreasing both in intensity and frequency. Well, that's, first of all, you wouldn't hear that at CNN, right, or MSNBC or anywhere else. But you will also hear, and I do agree with this, that the amount of devastation, which is the top chart, have gone up dramatically. And there are some very good reasons for that, not the least of which increased population and the increase of the amount of valuable infrastructure where some of these hurricanes are hitting. So with that as a background, let me just, before we take our first break, read from Vijay Jayavij, and I'm sure I'm totally butchering his name, but he points out again that he is so concerned about the individuals that have been affected by Dorian's winds and rains, the flooding. If you've seen the pictures, it's just devastating. And so yesterday we even talked about in the first hour, which you probably didn't have a chance to hear that, what can we do? Well, we can certainly do a few things. And first of all, we can support organizations, whether it's the Red Cross or faith-based organizations like Samaritan's Purse or World Vision or the Baptist Men or others that are going to try to help out. But he, as a meteorologist, then wants to take on this other issue because he has heard so many people say that because of this devastation of a Category 5 hurricane, it illustrates that this is due to climate change. And he says, of course, what climate change alarmists are saying is not that the climate is changing. Of course, the change in a climate or the change in weather patterns, of course, creates a hurricane. He says they mean global warming over the past 50 years or so, driven to dangerous levels by human emissions of carbon dioxide. This, they claim, is causing more extreme weather events like the recent wildfires in the Amazon and the Category 5 hurricanes like Dorian. And so that is kind of the issue that is being brought there. So then he tries to bring some facts and figures, which you can read in their entirety. But first of all, he points out that NOAA, which would be the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, it actually has data for U.S. hurricane strikes by decade, and these reach all the way back to 1851. And so he even provides a link, and we have that on our website so you can read it for yourself. They show that there has actually been a 50% reduction in the number of hurricanes or major hurricanes making landfall in the United States since the 1930s. For the entire period, there have been a slight downward trend in frequency, but the decline since the 1930s is remarkable. Okay, so they've been less frequent. What about the issue of intensity? And so we'll come back and talk about that as well. And if you find yourself saying, okay, I've got to read it for myself, because, you know, these people in CNN, they must know what they're talking about, right? You know, even at the Weather Channel. Okay, well, let's look at the data. And when we come back, we'll talk about this. If no other reason than this hurricane, as devastating as it is and will be, is not an argument for the Green New Deal. And I think we'll make some cases for that right after these important messages.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
You know, teenagers are sending sexually explicit images and videos to each other at an alarming rate. That is the conclusion of a study posted recently in the journal Pediatrics. The journal article, Prevalence of Multiple Forms of Sexting Behavior Among Youth, is a meta-analysis of 39 worldwide studies that included 110,000 participants. They found that sexting is more common than most parents would even imagine. The studies focused on teens between the ages of 12 and 17. The researchers estimated about 1 in 7 kids sent sexting messages and more than 1 in 4 received them. The authors suggest that the discrepancy in these numbers is due to the fact that some teens send sexting messages to multiple people. Now, one of the conclusions of the study is something that you would probably already know if you talk to any teenagers. They found the girls are often pressured by boys to send a sexually explicit photo. I sit on a board with an adolescent psychologist who often asks a teenage girl why she sends a photo. The answer is always the same. She was pressured to do so. Parents need to communicate lots of things to their children in light of this new research finding. First, we should remind them of the permanence of these images. They may think they're sending these pictures and videos to a trusted friend, but we hear so many stories about images that were then passed on to others. Then these images are passed on again. Soon these sexually explicit images can be found all over the internet. Second, we should tell kids never to send a sexting message to anyone, but we also need to tell them not to ask for them. The research shows that boys are 4 times more likely to pressure girls to send sexting messages. Parents need to talk to their daughters and their sons. Sexting is more common than we would ever have imagined. That's why parents need to get involved. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
Take Kerby and the Point of View team with you on the go with the Point of View app. Search for Point of View Radio at the Apple or Google Play stores.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back once again, if you'd like to join our conversation, 1-800-351-1212. Since so many of us are watching Hurricane Dorian, it is almost natural that individuals that are trying to put it in some kind of context will say, well, the frequency and intensity of these hurricanes is due to global warming. Or due to climate change, or whatever phrase might be used. And it's a nice little catchphrase. Problem with it, it's not accurate. And as we pointed out just a minute ago, you can go to the NOAA information, and that stands for National Oceanic Atmospheric Administration. They have U.S. hurricane strikes by decade, reaching all the way back to 1851. You can read it for yourself. And what you'll find is there's been a remarkable reduction in the number of major hurricanes making landfall in the United States since the 1930s. So first of all, the frequency is decreasing. That is of small comfort to people being devastated by Dorian right now. But I'm trying to back off a little bit from the anecdotes and the illustrations to at least get some perspective on that. But okay, let's talk about anecdotes for just a minute. You might say, well, it seems like there's more frequency. You know, you've heard the statistic that there have been 4 major Cat 5 hurricanes in the last 4 years. First of all, I'm not sure that's accurate, but okay, let's concede the point. There were 2 Category 5 hurricanes in 1933 in the same year. 2 in the same year. You might say, what happened after that? Then you had the major hurricane, Labor Day hurricane, which happened in 1935. So there you have, and that was, again, I think that was Category 5 as well. So you have all these hurricanes back in the 1930s. Nobody then was calling for a Green New Deal. Nobody then was saying that this is due to climate change or global warming because it hadn't really been invented as a concern back then. But those are examples of that. You have, for those in our state of Florida, they might remember Hurricane Camille. That was Category 5. That was 1968. You had some in 1970. You had some in 1990. I mean, we can go down the long list of just massive hurricanes that have hit. But the reality is, as we have documented in this particular article, which you can read for yourself, and if you say, well, why should I believe him? Maybe he's getting paid by the gas companies. First of all, he lives in India. I doubt it. Okay. Nevertheless, okay. But you can read it for yourself, because what he has here is links so that you can go to the National Oceanic Atmospheric Administration and read them for yourself. And first of all, there's no increase in hurricane frequency. What about increase in hurricane strength? And again, although damage done by hurricanes, he says, has risen, the increase is entirely because more people and property are in their paths. That correlates very much with the commentary I wrote back in October 2nd, 2018, which has the graph that you can read and watch for yourself. And he says hurricane intensity shows no sign of increase in the past 90 years. In fact, there's been a slight decrease. And again, for those of you watching online, I'll hold up my chart one more time, and you can see that there's a slight decrease in intensity there as well. Now, that is, again, where he provides the data from the National Oceanic Atmospheric Administration. And you might say, well, is that biased? I mean, after all, Trump's in office now. Is it possible that somebody played with the numbers? No, because these numbers have been there for decades before anybody even thought that he would be president of the United States. But okay, let's go to someone else. The United Nations Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. That's called the IPCC. And if you've ever heard us talk about climate change on this particular program, we talk about the IPCC. They very much believe that climate change is an issue. It's something that needs to be addressed immediately, and they would certainly endorse, if not all, certainly very significant points of the so-called Green New Deal. So they're about as far over on the environmental spectrum as you can imagine. And their special climate report of 2018 finds what? No evidence for the hypothesis that global warming caused extreme weather events to increase. So again, I think if you find yourself sometimes hearing people on the news saying this is due to climate change, if they mean that the climate changes, okay, I'm not going to argue about that point. But what they really mean is this means that we have climate change, we have a climate change disaster, and as a result, we need to have the Green New Deal. And I will guarantee without any hesitation that this month, when we have the third presidential Democratic debates, that you will hear numerous people use Hurricane Dorian and the fires in the Amazon as a reason for why we need the Green New Deal. By the way, I didn't really respond to the Amazon issue because even people there that are environmentalists have said, no, these fires are no different than what we've had in previous years. And so that is certainly one good example of something that has been hyped by people, sometimes out of the country of Brazil, to try to make their case. And if you want to read another piece that relates to this issue of climate change, my August 20th commentary is entitled Hottest Month. And that's where Roy Spencer, Dr. Roy Spencer, has been on the program with us before and has been on some of these talk shows recently as a climatologist, pointed out that if you look at the temperatures being measured on Earth in many of these terrestrial thermometers, okay, then July 2019 was hotter than July 2016, which everybody said was the hottest month. But he said if you really look at, again, NOAA, which again is the very significant and reliable source for so much of this information, and their climate forecast system, you can actually, as you look at the map there, see that it wasn't the hottest month. It may have been one of the 4 hottest months in the last 4 decades, but that's about it. And actually, if you look at that map, and we've posted that as well on the August 20th commentary, those of you in the Midwest all the way down to Texas will notice that there's sort of a blue line there. And the reason that is the case is that those particular states actually were cooler than normal. And here in the state of Texas, where we broadcast, we've actually had, interestingly enough, fewer 100-degree days than normal, although I hear we're supposed to get some by the end of the week. And so it just correlates very much with our own particular experience in that regard. So I just thought I'd put that on the table just to give you a chance to look at and hear some of those comments real quickly. When we come back from the break, I do want to spend some time talking about this issue of a serious gun proposal and mass shootings. But just before we do so, let me just mention real quickly that Ben Shapiro has a great column that came out today in which he says, when I first met Elizabeth Warren back when she was a professor of Harvard Law School, and she was an individual that published this best-selling book called The Two-Income Trap, in which he was concerned about the fact that there was a rising number of bankruptcies among middle-class parents. And her assessment was that because you have this massive expansion of the labor market, it created more stressful living, it drove down the median wages, but it increased housing. And so she argued against more government regulation of the housing market because she said these complex regulations might actually make the problem worse rather than better. And so in many cases, as she was talking about this, she even argued in favor of school choice, gave all sorts of arguments that if you were to listen to Elizabeth Warren and quote from her back in 2003 and 2004, you would say it sounds very much like many of the things we've talked about with the Penna Dexter in terms of what happened when you had the baby boom wanting to get houses, when all of a sudden then you could use both the husband and the wife's income to actually qualify for a mortgage. It rose the prices of housing and all sorts of other things. And so then he says, now fast forward to Warren now. What happened? One word, he says, power. Because all of a sudden now, in her quest to protect consumers, she began to want to propose this idea of a Consumer Finance Protection Bureau, which would be an independent agency without any serious checks or balances. And she really wanted to become the head of the CFPB, but the Republican senators did not go along. So, of course, now she's in the presidential race, the 2020 presidential race, sort of as a Bernie Sanders knockoff. And if nothing else, now is not known for her moderation, not known for evaluating some of these government proposals. She is a full-on supporter of government involved in every aspect of our lives. And I love how Ben Shapiro ends his piece. If Elizabeth Warren circa 2003 were running, she'd be the odds-on favorite to be president. But if Warren circa 2019 was up, she would actually hate Warren circa 2003. So the current Elizabeth Warren differs dramatically from the Elizabeth Warren of 15 years ago, although let's not say that she wasn't a liberal, but she wasn't quite as wild as she is today and as radical as she is today. But that maybe illustrates what it takes in order to win the Democratic presidential nomination. We'll find out more when the presidential debate takes place later this month. We'll be right back.
So when people first hear about Medishare, they have questions. Some good ones, like, what is it? Well, Medishare is a Christian healthcare sharing ministry. It's not health insurance. It's a different way of doing things, which leads us to this question. Why do so many become Medishare members? Two big reasons. They save a lot. The typical family saves $500 a month, and they feel great about it. With Medishare, you aren't forced to pay for things you don't believe in. Find out more. 855-SHARE-40. That's 855-SHARE-40.
It seems we can't get through a day without hearing how science has been corrupted to support political goals. Media entities have sold out truth for the sake of favored narratives. Even some religious groups have abandoned the Bible to support things based on feelings. So who can you trust? Kerby Anderson and the Point of View Truth Team are your source for real news. Learn how you can make a difference by joining the team at pointofview.net/team or call 800-347-5151. In a world of unending fog, Point of View is a shining light. Do your part at pointofview.net/team or 800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Back once again, if you'd like to join our conversation, 1-800-351-1212. Obviously, of course, the shooting in Midland, or Odessa, whichever one you want to mention, we'll call him the Odessa shooter, has certainly raised once again the need to come up with something that might prevent some of this from taking place. And really, up until now, the argument has always been, what would background checks do? You think of those individuals that have perpetrated a crime, that have been engaged in a mass shooting. Most of them, but not all, actually did qualify to get a background check, or their relatives did. In the case of the shooter in Newtown, Connecticut, it was the mother that legally obtained the rifle that he then used to kill her and then kill the kids in elementary school. And in some cases, these shootings have taken place in states where there are lots of restrictive laws. Gilroy, California is a good example. I mean, if you look at the various states based upon the kind of restrictions for gun ownership, usually California's at the top. Connecticut's in the top 3 or 4 as well. And so what else would you do to actually prevent that from taking place? But here's where something has changed because of the Odessa shooter. I never mention their names, but just so it doesn't get too complex, let me at least mention his first name is Seth. We won't go any further than that. Seth, interestingly enough, failed a background check back in 2014. The governor of the state of Texas, Greg Abbott, first said that, and DPS spokesman confirmed that. And so that's the first time you've had somebody say, okay, he failed a background check, but he had a weapon. How did he get it? Private sale. And so that led the lieutenant governor, Dan Patrick, to say, I believe, as a supporter of the Second Amendment, we should protect family transfer or family sale. But any stranger-to-stranger sale, he felt maybe was a real loophole in the law. And he said, I think the NRA, meaning the National Rifle Association, needs to get behind the president on that issue and really address this issue. So this may be the kind of the classic illustration that could be used by various proponents for a universal background check. Now, I have posted a very insightful piece by Kevin Williamson in which he points out that most of these proposals, first of all, are not going to go anywhere. On the second page, he talks about, for example, right after the Odessa shooting, Joe Biden, former vice president, presidential candidate, said that we should ban magazines that hold multiple bullets. Okay, that one really got people rolling their eyes because that's what magazines do. They hold multiple bullets. So if indeed what he means is we will ban all magazines, then you also mean it's an effective ban on all handguns and rifles, even a lot of shotguns. So you find yourself very quickly saying, well, that proposal probably, first of all, is not going to go anywhere because if you heard me mention this yesterday, and I'll do it again, the Pew Research study found that basically almost a majority of Americans live in a household with a firearm, 42%. Now, if you go to rural areas, and I go to rural areas all the time. I was in Alaska. I was in Minnesota this last week. It's 58%. Now, you aren't going to get those individuals to say, I'm just going to give up any gun that has a magazine. That's just not happening, especially if you're a Democratic candidate for the presidency. I don't care who you are, and recognize that a lot of those individuals that own firearms are in states like, Michigan, Ohio, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin. These are the states that Hillary Clinton lost last time. So that's probably not going to happen. Now, one of the things that Kevin Williamson does point out, interestingly enough, is really where we can make a difference is in what he calls ordinary, unglamorous, labor-intensive law enforcement and public health work. the kinds of things where we track down the bad guys, where we do maybe a better job of health care screening, mental health screening, those kinds of things. He says we complain about straw buyers but rarely prosecute them. Again, that's an argument that is sometimes made that I find somewhat fallacious. I have been at gun shows, and I know one time I was just watching where this guy was going to buy a gun, and then he just happened to say, we're going to go hunting. And he goes, who's we? Well, me and my son. Well, you're going to let your son use it? Well, that's a straw purchase. I mean, almost immediately stopped the conversation because you are not allowed to buy a gun for someone else. And so I found that most of the responsible individuals will prevent that. But he talks about that as one possibility. But then he goes on to say that really where a lot of this needs to take place is with criminals. But he says chasing those troublesome scamps around the block is a lot of work and expensive. He says by the end of the first quarter of 2018, the Philadelphia Police Department had used up all of its $57 million allotment of overtime pay for the year. And so you can begin to see that if we're really going to get serious, it's going to be spending money not on, trying to ban a gun here or there or ammunition or whatever, but it's going to be public health work. It's going to be law enforcement, those kinds of things. And so if you want to read that, it's a very helpful piece to remind us that you're going to hear all sorts of statements being made at the next Democratic presidential debate. Well, we need to do this, we need to do that, we need to do this. But the bottom line is there aren't going to be just as many solutions as you might think. What about this idea of a universal background check? That's one of the things I address in my August 28th commentary, which I point out not only are you talking about the fact that a lot of Americans live in a home with guns, but in order for a background check that's universal to be implemented and to be effective, you're going to need a national gun registry. And this kind of brings me to some of the great conversation that took place off mic. I've oftentimes said we should leave the microphones on during the breaks because at one point I was talking about how this idea of a national gun registry is not going to really necessarily work very well when you have a majority of people, especially in rural America, but almost a majority of Americans that live in a home with a gun. Do they want a national registry? So that's where off mic, Nick Pitts was saying, well, what about state? And I said, well, some people said you could have a state registry. Others said, well, maybe you could even have an independent agency keep those, because otherwise, how would you prove that I actually went through a background check unless indeed we kept a record of all of those things? And so then I said, well, then now think about this. How many of you in the listening audience right now have had your identity stolen or maybe know somebody that has? I bet most of your hands went up. How many of you have had a credit card that was issued by the credit card company because they feared that their particular organization or their database had been hacked, and so they wanted to make sure that this new credit card was not one that was out there in the black market? You can kind of see where we're going with this. If you have any kind of gun registry, whether it's owned by the federal government, and it almost would have to if it's a federal government regulation, or states, or independent, somebody's going to hack into it, and then they're now going to post. No doubt, maybe they won't, but somebody else will be glad to post the names of all the people that own guns in the neighborhood. What happens next? Think this through for just a minute. If you're a burglar, this is going to be wonderful for you because now you know which homes have guns and which homes don't have guns. Because when you are in a state where there's a fairly high percentage of gun ownership and you knock down the back door and come in, your hope is there's not somebody going to greet you on the other side of that door with a gun aimed at you. And this would certainly be helpful for you to be able to know who would be the softer targets for your robberies. Of course, there are other criminals that might say, no, I want to know where the guns are because, after all, I'm not going to be able to qualify for a background check. So I want to just go in there and steal the guns from these homeowners so that then I have a gun that I can use in the perpetration of a crime. You can kind of see where this takes us pretty quickly. And so if indeed we do move towards universal background checks, it does sound a little bit like a loophole, The concern is what happens next? And that is a question that I will be interested in seeing how people respond to. We come back from a break, though. I also want to talk about John Smirik's piece here. Mass shootings cause mass delusions. And he's got some good comments about that as well. And then we'll get into, just real quickly, a couple of comments about the trade war. And then we'll get into our conversation in the next hour with our good friend John Stonestreet as we talk about this new book on the area of marriage, life, and religious liberty. And also talk with him about some of the things that they're doing there at the Breakpoint Commentary. What would you say? A new video series that will really equip you to be able to give good answers. And before it's all through, I got a feeling we'll talk a little bit about the gay gene and even some things about archaeology. We got a lot to cover with him, but we have a few more things to cover before we talk with him, and that will happen right after these important messages.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
After a few more minutes, let me just mention our second article we've posted today by John Smirik, who's been on the program with before. It's entitled Mass Shootings Cause Mass Delusions, and I won't go through all of it, but it really reminds us of a couple of things. He says, even as violent crime has fallen greatly since the 1970s and 80s, Americans have been forced to process a hideous innovation, that is, widespread nihilistic mass killings. These have increased in frequency, feeding off of each other. And he goes into some of the details related to that, but it's a reminder once again that even if we could have, in many cases, used these background checks. Up until the Odessa shooter, very few of those would have been weeded out. But in the state of Texas, you have the shooting in Sutherland Springs where somebody might have been eliminated if the data had been transferred. And in this particular case, maybe if a private transfer had. But he reminds us that if we're really serious about trying to stop mass shootings, we're going to have to give up a lot of liberty, and we're probably not going to do that. He points out, as an illustration, after 9/11, there was a time in which some in the Bush administration wondered whether or not to maybe task the FBI with infiltrating virtually every mosque in the country. And yet the decision by President George W. Bush and his administration was that the price would be too high in terms of religious freedom. And so as a result, you know, there are individuals that might be able to be walking free who are Muslim terrorists, or in this case, potential domestic terrorists. And it is difficult if we are going to value our freedom to do so. But I might come back to the comment he made just in passing, because some people say, is that really true? And that goes back to an August 19th commentary that I wrote. And again, I'm mentioning some of these, so if you want to read them yourself or even pass them on to individuals, post them on your Facebook page. Go to pointofview.net and just do the search. But I point out that the Washington Post are the ones that actually were very concerned that most Americans incorrectly think that gun murder rates have gotten worse, not better. If you look at the murder rate, it's actually dropped by almost half. And so we are probably safer than we ever have been. Of course, you wouldn't feel that way if you were in one of these mass shootings, but the reality is that when we talk about these gun-related homicides, first of all, you've got to recognize that, as I point out in this commentary and as is pointed out in the Pew Research studies, you can look either at the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention data, or you can look at the Pew Research. They all come to the same conclusion. You pick any year. Gun suicides outnumber gun homicides by most of the time by 2 to 1. So first of all, a lot of these gun violence statistics are artificially inflated because they're merging together suicides with shootings. The other issue is that we, in the press, cover Midland, where you had 7 dead, 22 injured. The press didn't cover something that happened at the same time, and that's in Chicago. 9 dead, 35 wounded. So you can begin to see that we are selective in terms of even how we cover that. And for people that are saying it's getting more dangerous out there in terms of gun-related homicides, consider these 4 factors, which I'm going to put in a future commentary. The first, where you live. Turns out, and you've heard me say this before, according to the Crime Prevention Research Center, more than 50% of all the murders occur in 2% of the 3,000 counties in the United States. So where you live, very important. Number 2, your partner. According to a study that was in the Hastings Law Journal, people recently or currently involved in abusive relationships are much more likely to be victims of gun-related homicides. So who your partner might be is another one. Number 3, are you in a gang? That brings me back to Chicago now, doesn't it? According to the Department of Justice's National Gang Center, and particularly in urban areas, significant percentages of gun homicides are related to gang activity and drug activity. And number 4, are you a male between the ages of 15 and 34? Where, again, the significant number of murder victims are in that range. Also, I might even add a 5th that some people don't add, but I certainly could add it. Are you African American? Because oftentimes they are, sadly, as you look in places like Chicago, those that are most likely to be murdered. So when you pay attention to all of that, you recognize that you maybe aren't always getting the full story from the mainstream press. And I might just mention that then John Smerrick in his argument goes on to point out that even though non-citizens make up about 4% illegal, another 4% legal immigrants, so about 8.4%, they're responsible, according to the U.S. Sentencing Commission, to 42% of kidnapping convictions, 31% of drug convictions, 22%, almost 23%, money laundering convictions, and on and on. You can read that for yourself. And again, recognize that sometimes the press doesn't cover some of these stories very effectively. But just before we end this hour and spend some time with John Stonestreet, from time to time we do mention the China trade wars. And it was interesting to see this because just the other day there was an op-ed that was written by Chen Guangqing. You might remember him. We've talked about him before or did a short interview with him years ago. He's the human rights activist from China who is blind and was the individual who is so well known for talking about the one-child policy in China and forced abortions. But in his recent commentary said, Trump has the right strategy on Beijing. Here's just a couple of quotes. Chen Guangqing says, Trump is regularly criticized for being unpredictable and erratic, for ignoring diplomatic conventions, and for upending a tense but supposedly workable economic relationship. But he says, but as someone who has spent years with the knife edge of the Chinese Communist Party bearing down on my throat, I know the president is on to something. He goes on to say, presidents before Donald Trump naively believed that China would abide by international standards of behavior if it were granted access to global institutions and generally treated as a normal country. But that path has proven mistaken, and Beijing ignored Western pressure on matters from human rights to the widespread theft of intellectual property. Trump, whatever his flaws, grasps this reality. He then says that Donald Trump is the first president in recent memory to seriously say to this communist dictatorship, if you want to keep doing business with us, you have to change. And so I thought it was kind of interesting to see that an individual that we've talked with before is very concerned about what is happening in China and recognizing that maybe keeping the pressure on is a good thing. But on the other side, let me also mention that our friends at the Wall Street Journal yesterday point out that manufacturing is not doing well. Incoming sales seem to be slowing down, and this is usually the busy season for those in the area of manufacturing. They cite concerns about the economy and some of the tariffs. And, of course, as the editors of the Wall Street Journal point out, this is not surprising. Businesses from Best Buy to Caterpillar this summer reported that President Trump's trade brawls were disrupting supply chains, reducing exports, raising material costs, and delaying investment decisions. And so, again, they point out that Donald Trump can rightly boast that he added more manufacturing jobs since he took office than Barack Obama during his entire second term, but he might lose the bragging rights if this continues on. Let's hope that we get some changes in China and we can remove some of those tariffs because it is certainly hurting some of you out there in the listening audience. Well, let's take a break. We have a lot more to cover, and we're going to spend some time with our good friend John Stonestreet in the next hour. And if you'd like to join us, I'm sure he'd love to hear from you. 1-800-351-1212, president of the Colson Center for Christian Worldview and one of the commentaries for Breakpoint. He'll be on with us right after this.
It is a horrible scenario, but it happens. Dennis writes about his wife who was diagnosed with leukemia. She's now a 2-time survivor. They ran up over $1 million in medical bills. Thankfully, they're Medishare members, and Dennis says they're so thankful for that, how people came together to meet their needs. Medishare works, and it can save you a lot of money. The typical family saves $500 a month. Find out more. Call 855-SHARE-40. That's 855-SHARE-40.
Every day we face new challenges. At the time of Jonah, the Bible says in Nineveh, they couldn't tell their right hand from their left. But in America today, a bunch of people can't tell men from women. In fact, some say men can be women. Christians are called to proclaim God's truth in every area of life. But who has time to study every crazy new thing the world can think of? I'm glad you asked. Get the information you need every day with Kerby's Viewpoints commentary. Sign up to receive them via email at pointofview.net/viewpoints or find them on the Point of View radio app. Viewpoints commentaries, making sense of the world around us. pointofview.net/viewpoints. Point of View will continue after this.
just want to thank you so much for all the wonderful programming you have. You're just absolutely fantastic.
I recently started listening to Point of View, and I really found it interesting because of the different subjects you cover. Thank you for that.
I really appreciate everything that you do in keeping us informed.
Thank you, Kerby, for everything that you have been doing. I appreciate all the work that you're doing, advocating for the Word of God. Thank you so much.
Point of view, I think, is absolutely necessary because it's a Christian perspective, a biblical worldview perspective, and receive very current, up-to-date information about what is really going on, week to week in our culture, which is changing so rapidly, and yet it's morally sliding backwards.
Yeah, I'm just, first of all, I thank you guys. Y'all's program is wonderful, and enjoy it every day. I learn so much every time I listen to it.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.
Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging: apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View continues right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
This hour, we're going to spend some time talking with our good friend John Stonestreet. And as soon as we connect up with him, we'll have a chance to hear a little bit more about all the things happening at Breakpoint. But just before we do so, let me just mention a couple of other issues that are front and center. If you were listening to our program last Friday, we talked about this issue. We just sort of mentioned it in passing about the so-called faithless elector. To understand that, you have to recognize that when you go to vote for the president, you're really voting for electors who will then go to your state capital and actually cast the vote. And in some cases, there are individuals who are pledged to vote one way and decide to vote a different way. And so the case out of Colorado is an individual that was supposed to vote for Hillary Clinton in 2016, goes to the state capitol in Denver, and instead writes in John Kasich, then the Republican governor of Ohio. The Colorado Secretary of State removed him and brought in another elector. And so the 10th Circuit Court of Appeals has ruled that presidential electors do not have to follow the results of their popular vote in their states. In other words, they once they're chosen, then the state cannot remove them or nullify their their vote. So again, that's a case that may end up going to the Supreme Court. And it's interesting because out of the state of Washington, they have ruled that electors must follow the rules of the popular vote. So it will be interesting because this is one of those cases that will most likely go to the Supreme Court because you got differing and conflicting rulings. And so we'll see how that does. I predict if indeed the high court does take the case, and they'd have to take it when they come into session in October, and try to rule on that before the 2020 election. But if they do, I think they'll probably have to uphold the Colorado ruling, but also predict that some of the justices might make a number of comments about the constitutionality of the Electoral College, given the fact that we have two elections in less than 2 decades that were decided by the electoral vote rather than the popular vote. So that's a case which on Friday, when I have Jeremy Dice with us from the Liberty Institute, we'll talk a little bit more about that. But it's an interesting case and one that we'll be following here on Point of View. Let's, if we can, now go to our good friend John Stonestreet. He's the president of the Colson Center for Christian Worldview. Of course, you know that he has been a teacher at Summit Ministries, also, of course, was on the faculty at Bryan College, and an individual that graduated from Bryan College as well as Trinity Evangelical Divinity School. We've had him on in the past talking about all sorts of different books, A Practical Guide to Culture, Restoring All Things, Same-Sex Marriage, and Making Sense of Your World. But he, along with David Dockery, have put together this book called Life, Marriage, and Religious Liberty. So we're going to talk about the 10th anniversary of the Manhattan Declaration. We've posted his piece on the gay gene. I know he's going to have something to say about that. And, of course, from time to time, we quote him and Eric Metaxas and others when they talk about archaeology. So we're going to cover a lot of issues over the next hour. And John Stonestreet, it's always a delight to have you on Point of View.
Hey, thank you, Kerby. It's always good to be on with you.
You know, I'm just thinking that it would really be good if you put together a video series sometime that would equip people to answer tough questions. Maybe you could call it, What Would You Say? Now, you're laughing because you wonder about that. I've been promoting this because I am such a fan of Breakpoint, but I think this is genius, putting together this new video series so that people can kind of get a on-the-street, spontaneous, what would you say if somebody asked you a question about the gay gene or asked you a question about same-sex marriage? And I'm just thrilled that you're adding that to all the other great material you have there at Breakpoint.
Hey, Kirby, thanks so much for mentioning that. We're so excited about this. About a year ago, we joined forces with Joseph Backholm, and some of your listeners will recognize Joseph. He was leading the Family Policy Institute of Washington and had done this really creative video where he had gone on a college campus and asked about, whether, truth and reality or whatever we want it to be, and whether we can self-identify. And you might remember this is the famous 6'2" Chinese woman video when Joseph is a 5'8" white dude. So I don't know if you remember that one, but
I do.
But Joseph had this. Yeah, Joseph had this vision of creating these videos to help everyday Christians think and speak through these controversial issues. And we had that same vision. So we're super excited. We have 3 videos that are live now. We'll be adding a video each week. And just think short, understandable, repeatable, and shareable. And that's really what the goal is. Very specific questions. Does a man have a right to speak up on an abortion? Does rape justify an abortion? Does life begin at conception? Those are the ones on the life issues. We have a whole series of videos coming on the gender issue, on apologetics. Is atheism more rational than Christianity? All these very specific questions that we get asked, Kirby, all the time.
And so, again, one of the things I do so often here on Point of View is I'll point people to a PragerU video that I think would be helpful. I'm going to certainly start pointing them to the What Would You Say video series. So you're going to get a lot of free publicity because I certainly think that anything we can do to equip the body of Christ to be more effective. And some of these questions, as you know, John, are really kind of vexing, whether it's homosexuality and the gay gene, whether it's genetic engineering. Just a while ago, I was talking about everything from gun policies to China trade. I mean, we're trying in different ways through different ministries, but we all have the same goal of just equipping the saints. So I just think what you're doing is outstanding, and kudos to the video producers out there who bring a level of expertise that you and I benefit from.
Yeah, there's no kidding. And we all need these sorts of things. And I don't know how many moms and dads, get asked questions from their own kids, I mean, some of these issues used to, be afar off. And now it could be your kid comes home and says, hey, remember Johnny? Now he's Susie. What should I say? And that's exactly what we're trying to do here. And you're right that these ideas are everywhere. We call some of them zombie ideas. The whole gay gene question. I mean, that's one of those ideas that should have died a long time ago, but it keeps the born this way thing. I mean, it keeps having this kind of resurrection and influence on our culture. And again, Christians have to be ready to give an answer and to be able to speak what's true and to do it in a way that's clear and confident and based in truth.
Well, again, this book that we're talking about is really kind of a 10th anniversary of the Manhattan Declaration, and it is entitled Life, Marriage, and Religious Liberty. We have a link to it on our website, and maybe when we come back from the break, we can talk about not only once it came out, but I'll hold up my little booklet here that we have on social media because I mentioned the Manhattan Declaration there because back 10 years ago when we talked about the fact that there might be some places where the so-called big tech society and organizations would be kind of trying to do what they can to limit the kind of exposure that we take for granted. I use the examples from, for example, the Manhattan Declaration and a variety of others. And if it was a bad problem 10 years ago, it's gotten worse today. So we want to talk about that and give people a little bit of an update on the history. And for those of you that maybe want to follow along, of course, we have information about the book, and you can probably find it in your local bookstore, but we also have a way in which you can order it, both in hardback and in Kindle. And we're going to look at the whole issue of life and why life matters, then marriage, what marriage matters most, and then the whole issue of religious liberty. And so we'll spend some time talking with our good friend John Stonestreet. May get into a few of those breakpoint commentaries before we're done. We'll be right back.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
You know, teenagers are sending sexually explicit images and videos to each other at an alarming rate. That is the conclusion of a study posted recently in the journal Pediatrics. The journal article, Prevalence of Multiple Forms of Sexting Behavior Among Youth, is a meta-analysis of 39 worldwide studies that included 110,000 participants. They found that sexting is more common than most parents would even imagine. The studies focused on teens between the ages of 12 and 17. The researchers estimated about 1 in 7 kids sent sexting messages and more than 1 in 4 received them. The authors suggest that the discrepancy in these numbers is due to the fact that some teens send sexting messages to multiple people. Now, one of the conclusions of the study is something that you would probably already know if you talk to any teenagers. They found the girls are often pressured by boys to send a sexually explicit photo. I sit on a board with an adolescent psychologist who often asks a teenage girl why she sends a photo. The answer is always the same. She was pressured to do so. Parents need to communicate lots of things to their children in light of this new research finding. First, we should remind them of the permanence of these images. They may think they're sending these pictures and videos to a trusted friend, but we hear so many stories about images that were then passed on to others. Then these images are passed on again. Soon these sexually explicit images can be found all over the internet. Second, we should tell kids never to send a sexting message to anyone, but we also need to tell them not to ask for them. The research shows that boys are 4 times more likely to pressure girls to send sexting messages. Parents need to talk to their daughters and their sons. Sexting is more common than we would ever have imagined. That's why parents need to get involved. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
Take Kerby and the Point of View team with you on the go with the Point of View app. Search for Point of View Radio at the Apple or Google Play stores.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
John Stonestreet with us today as he and David Dockery have put together this wonderful collection of various essays on life, marriage, and religious liberty. And I think it is important to cover this for a couple of reasons. Yesterday, John, we did our Millennial Roundtable, and I was looking around here and recognizing when I go back 10 years, some of the participants in the Millennial Roundtable probably say, yeah, I think I've heard of Chuck Colson. I don't even know what this Manhattan Declaration is. So take us back to the fall of 2009, and even for our listeners that may remember it, there has been so much that has happened over the last 10 years in the whole area of life, marriage, and religious liberty, hasn't it?
Well, there has, and I think you're exactly right. It's kind of hard to believe that it has been 10 years and how much has changed in 10 years. But really, it was the Manhattan Declaration wasn't the nuclear project. I'll begin with that. That's what it wasn't. That's different.
Yeah.
The Manhattan Declaration, though, was a statement that was compiled by Chuck Colson, Timothy George, the Dean of Beeson Divinity School, and Robbie George at Princeton University. And then, and this is important, was signed by 500,000 Christians who said that no matter what changes legally or culturally on these issues of life, marriage, and religious liberty, here's where we draw the line, that these are things we cannot cross the line on, that life is sacred from all stages, from conception to natural death, that marriage is designed by God and functions as a lifelong relationship between man and woman, and that ultimately our conscience belongs not to the state, but to God. And the final line of the Manhattan Declaration, this is a 6-page document that walks through these 3 issues. And it wasn't a statement like, how bad it is that everything is changing, or here's what the culture should do. It was kind of pitched that way, I think, by a lot of its critics, that, the Christians are trying to tell culture what to believe. But at the end of the day, it was a statement saying, look, culture is going to change on these issues. Here's where Christians must stand. And the final line of it, I think, is the most important and the most enduring, which reads this. It's that we can ungrudgingly render to Caesar what belongs to Caesar, but we can never render to Caesar what belongs to God. Now, that was 10 years ago. And 10 years ago, legally, we had Roe v. Wade, but other than that, there wasn't any sort of firm official ways that the state was, consistently encroaching on what belongs to God in these 3 areas. Fast forward 10 years later, we have the Obergefell decision, in which the state claims marriage. We have doctor-assisted suicide, in which my state, Colorado, as well as other states, have now enacted, and really there's a worldwide push for this. And obviously we've had these high-profile cases like with Jack Phillips and Baronel Stutzman, where the state and even the HHS mandate under President Obama, which has become kind of I think a case study of the government saying this is what religion is, and this is the extent of religious conviction, and this is where it belongs. So now we have 10 years later, the need for Christians to identify what belongs to God and what belongs to Caesar is more important than ever. And so in light of that, that's why David Dockery and I, in light of this history of the Manhattan Declaration, the 10th anniversary, but just all the cultural developments over the last 10 years, felt like, you know what, we need to revisit this. We need to go back and say, what does it mean to lend our conscience to God on these areas in this particular cultural moment? And praise God, there was just an all-star cast of thinkers and speakers and writers who wanted to participate, from Johnny Erickson Tata to Randy Alcorn, Frederica Matthews Green, Rick Warren, Ryan Anderson, Mary Eberstadt. I mean, the list is Kristen Wagner, who was Jack Phillips' attorney at the Supreme Court, just one after another who were willing to weigh in.
Well, and I might just mention when we're talking about that, of course, you and David Dockery have been on the program with us as well. But as you just mentioned, Kristen Wagner, Michael Ferris have been on the program with us, as well as Ryan Anderson and Johnny Erickson Tata, Frederica Matthews Green, Trevin Wax, Randy Alcorn, of course, Chuck Colson in the past. It's kind of a who's who of people we've had on the program. But since you brought that up, before we get into the specifics, the opening kind of essay is about what belongs to God, what belongs to Caesar. Timothy George wrote that, and I think it's a good illustration of why we need these kinds of documents, why we need to keep serious these kind of ideas, because at a time when the government wants to take over every aspect of our lives, and there's been maybe a little bit of pushback now with this current administration, but generally government's taking over more and more and doing more than any of the founders or any person that's over the age of 30 might have ever anticipated. It's all the more clear that we need to make sure that what is God's remains God's and is not taken over by the state.
It's absolutely right. And even in this kind of cultural moment in which politically there's been kind of a rolling back of some of the excesses of government under President Trump, rolling back kind of things that had happened before, the danger for us is to still see things as if the answer is going to come from the state. In other words, the answer to an ever-encroaching state is for the next state to come along and roll things back. That's what, Jacques Ellul and Chuck Colson would call the political illusion. And that's why I think a book like this is so important. A statement like the Manhattan Declaration is so important that, no matter where government goes, it doesn't change where we must stand. And isn't that the challenge of Christians in every generation? As the political context, as the cultural context continues to change, as the cultural waters become more challenging in this area or that area, Christian conviction is the same. The challenge is how do we live according to that Christian conviction when the pressure cooker is turned up, so to speak. And I think it's an equal temptation for us to think, well, the answer is going to come, as Chuck Colson used to say, the salvation never comes in Air Force One. In other words, the answer to an ever encroaching state isn't just a less encroaching state. The answer has got to be people of faith who draw the line in their own arenas and their own minds and their own hearts and their own lives and refuse to cross those lines no matter where culture comes down.
You know, it's interesting that just last week I happened to be up in the state of Alaska. We have a radio station up there, and we have a number of listeners. And I'm at this morning breakfast, and this one individual says, you know, a book that has really been helpful to me is a book called A Practical Guide to Culture. And I smile. And he's like, hey, have you heard of it? I even know the author. He was very impressed. But anyway, it was kind of interesting because that's what people are looking for. They're going, I don't know. Where's this rowboat, if I can use the metaphor from the book for just a minute? Where's this thing going, and is going downstream? And how can I help people begin to have a biblical witness in culture and everything? So even though he probably couldn't come up with your name off the top of his head, this book had made a profound impact in his life and something he wanted to pass on to young people who are probably growing up thinking, well, it's always been like this. No, it really hasn't, and you're really going to have to stand for your Christian convictions like never before.
Yeah, that's right. Well, thank you for those kind words, and thank our friend in Alaska. And if he had thought of my name, he'd probably butcher it. My name's been butchered in more ways. Sometimes it's so creative, it's kind of hard to believe. So, but you're right. I mean, look, we're just like our brothers and sisters in every other cultural context throughout history, which is we have to figure out how God's word applies to God's world. Praise God, we don't face the sort of challenges even that we heard about just this past week of this Bible translator for Wycliffe who was killed in front of his wife and the wife lost her arm. I mean, that's what it means for many of our brothers and sisters to follow Jesus in a difficult cultural moment. Ours, the persecution is what people have called soft persecution. It doesn't mean it doesn't hurt, but it's not quite the same. But the temptations are much more subtle. It's temptations of thought, temptations of our hearts and minds, little compromise here, little compromise there. But when it comes to these eternal truths about the dignity of life as God created it, as how God structured human relationships, and especially the marital relationship and who we ultimately belong to, those are things that we can't compromise on. And that's why the Manhattan Declaration was important 10 years ago, and that's why I think it's still a document that matters for us today, too.
Let's take a break, and when we come back, we have all sorts of things to cover. We'll cover some of this fairly quickly, but again, almost 200 pages of great material, and we have 6 essays on life and about the same on marriage and religious liberty. We also have a link, if you go to our website right now, to breakpoint.org, and if you are not already signing up to get their emails, it's a must-read every single day. And, of course, you're going to be wanting to watch those videos. What would you say? So that is available. If you click on the picture of the book, we have a place for you to order the book on hardcover or Kindle. But, of course, you can also get that from Breakpoint and from the Colson Center. So wherever you want to get it is fine. And if you find it in your local bookstore, please support your local bookstore that might have this as well. But we'll come back and talk about life, marriage, and religious liberty, and then may get into just a couple of those issues. Of course, as we talk about the issue of marriage and homosexuality, that gets us into another thing we've posted, a very good piece by John Stonestreet on the gay gene. So we have a lot more to cover. We'll do that right after this.
So when people first hear about Medi-Share, they have questions. Some good ones, like, what is it? Well, Medi-Share is a Christian healthcare sharing ministry. It's not health insurance. It's a different way of doing things, which leads us to this question. Why do so many become Medi-Share members? 2 big reasons. They save a lot. The typical family saves $500 a month, and they feel great about it. With Medi-Share, you aren't forced to pay for things you don't believe in. Find out more. 855-SHARE-40. That's 855-SHARE-40.
It seems we can't get through a day without hearing how science has been corrupted to support political goals. Media entities have sold out truth for the sake of favored narratives. Even some religious groups have abandoned the Bible to support things based on feelings. So who can you trust? Kerby Anderson and the Point of View Truth Team are your source for real news. Learn how you can make a difference by joining the team at pointofview.net/team or call 800-347-5151. In a world of unending fog, Point of View is a shining light. Do your part at pointofview.net/team or 800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Continue our conversation with John Stonestreet, president of the Colson Center for Christian Worldview, in course, the commentator for Breakpoint. And John, we're going to probably spend a fair amount of time talking about marriage, but let me at least give life its due. And that is some great essays there. But it's interesting that Chuck Colson was so prophetic. He could see changes happening. And we certainly have seen those in the area of marriage. Not so much in the area of life, except for this. It used to be an argument not so long ago that we want abortion to be safe, legal, and rare. At least that was the Clinton kind of catechism, if you will. But now we see there is a much greater willingness to let everybody see what really is intended, and that is abortion up to all 9 months, up to birth, and even afterwards. So that maybe is the most remarkable change that's taken place in the last 10 years, don't you think?
I think that is, yeah. I mean, and I think come on the tail of so many things in our culture becoming politicized, and I think that's one of the things that the Manhattan Declaration calls Christians, and by the way, Scripture calls Christians away from, which is allowing our lives to be fundamentally defined in political terms. When that happens, then you got the two sides of it, and the pro-life movement has been successful enough as to basically pull off any sort of camouflage that's been on the pro-abortion movement over the last couple of decades. I mean, gosh, you kind of whimsically remember those days of safe, legal, and rare, as opposed to these, Handmaid's Tale, costumes everywhere and just kind of ridiculous, analogies and just open slaughter of unborn. I'd say the other thing, though, I'd say two other things about the life issue, Kerby, that I think matters. First is that whereas 10 years ago, the fundamental challenge to life was at the front end of life, having to do with the unborn, I think we have a growing movement across America right now to legalize doctor-assisted suicide in various forms, including all out euthanasia. We certainly have it across, countries outside of the United States, but we have state after state that's moving that direction, and that's proven to be a very, very difficult thing to fight in a culture like ours, which defines freedom in the wrong way, which is with no restrictions, as opposed to the freedom to be who we're created to be versus the freedom to do whatever we want. And then also, obviously, abortion has one of the reasons that abortion has become so unpopular among Americans is because it's been exposed. Planned Parenthood has been exposed, the Unplanned movie, the Kermit Gosnell story, God's gift of the ultrasound is huge. But I would also say that one of the things that happens is that evil flourishes when it's hidden. And medical abortions, contraceptive abortions, what we might say, through prescriptions, that is keeping the abortion numbers high. Because it's happening outside of an abortion clinic, quote unquote. And that's something that hasn't changed. And probably those numbers are going up, although it's hard to kind of count those. So the life issue continues despite all the good news, I think, that we see in the movement.
Well said. Let's focus some of our time on marriage, and I love Mary Eberstadt, the Manhattan Declaration, then and now, vindication. We saw this coming. We talked about this on Point of View. We've talked about it with you. You've written about that. Chuck Colson saw it, as well as the Manhattan Declaration. There's going to come a time where you'll have the legalization of same-sex marriage, and then, as you point out, almost within an eye blink, then the focus on transgenderism. And all of this happened in a remarkably short period of time because of all the cultural forces aligned in just the right way. Some of the television programs, as you've talked about, Will and Grace and others, that sort of conditioned us to make this remarkable change in a very short period of time, since social movements usually take a lot longer than this particular one did.
It is stunning, isn't it? I mean, I think it's hard to imagine a more sweeping, successful social revolution. And we're talking about this, at the beginning of the 21st century. I was speaking to a group in Florida, in fact, mainly grandparents, and figured out the oldest guy in the room was in his mid-90s. And we were just talking about the number of social revolutions that this guy saw in his lifetime. When you think about both world wars and you think about the global struggle between communism in the West and so on. And, there was just social revolution after social revolution. And which one has had the most staying power? And which one has flipped culture from top to bottom? I mean, fundamentally altering everything from education to what signs we put over our restrooms.
Yes.
And nothing comes close than the sexual revolution. Now, you could say, and it happened without a war and without bloodshed. But, of course, abortion is one of the one of the areas of casualties of the sexual revolution. So it has been bloody, but at the same time, it's progressed primarily not through force, but through the imagination. And once the imagination was hijacked away from, gender norms and gender roles, and this kind of move from, male-female equality in rights, which was things that needed to be corrected in our culture, to male-female equality in roles, which was a mix of probably good and bad things that needed to happen. And so now we've got male and female being interchangeable in reality, as if men are women and women are men on the sheer condition that they proclaim it and identify it. And that changes everything. That changes parenting. That changes marriage. We talked about, Kerby, the What Would You Say videos. One of our first videos answers a question that's very common. Is love enough to make a family? And that's what we hear these days,
Very
right?
good. Yeah.
And, kids don't need a mom and a dad. They just need loving parents. But see, that's fundamentally remaking the idea of parenting as if male and female don't matter. And the hard part on this is, first of all, not only does all the research tell us it does matter, but secondly, we're playing games with children. We're socially experimenting on children. When you talk about hormone treatment and you talk about what we're teaching them in schools about sexuality and marriage, about what's right and wrong, when you talk about, drag queen story hour in the libraries, kids have always been the subjects of our experiments of the sexual revolution. We say ideas have consequences, bad ideas have victims, and children have been the victims of the sexual revolution. And the redefinition of marriage has been really the primary way that we've played games with children, and it's tragic.
And I might just mention that yesterday's Breakpoint commentary is on that, What Would You Say? And it actually has a good portion of that on Does Love Just Make a Family? Let me jump to the day before that, which we've posted for our listeners as well, The Search for the Gay Gene. And I think it illustrated, and I read some of your quote yesterday before you came on when we had our Millennial Roundtable, because you have the Wall Street Journal saying research finds genetic links to same-sex behavior, but then NPR says search for gay genes comes up short in the new study. And then others say we have a genetic link. So you can almost, with the headlines, see how if they want to promote the idea of the genetic basis for homosexuality, they go one direction. Or if they want to promote the idea of gender fluidity and sexual fluidity, they go the other way. And it shows you that it isn't science anymore. It's all worldview, isn't it?
Oh, wow. This was one of those stories where you just kind of sit back and watch and eat your popcorn, and it just illustrates so clearly, how things can be hijacked, Kerby. This was stunning. And I tell you, the thing that was stunning, too, is if you look at the study itself and the reports, the researchers claim that before they released it, they consulted with LGBTQIA advocacy.
Amazing.
I mean, can you think of any other area where scientists consult with the group that they're studying to figure out
how
what
to say
the right way is
in a way that's politically
data?
correct? Yeah, I know. I've never seen
Listen,
anyone.
I mean, one of the you haven't. I mean, again, this is when we talk about the success of the sexual revolution, and when somebody says to you the science is settled, I mean, this is proof. The science isn't settled. The way this story was spun was clearly media person after media person bending over backwards not to say the wrong things. and you also, by the way, have some of these groups that basically said we shouldn't report this because it's dangerous. What a fascinating sort of scenario, and it would be fascinating if it weren't so sad, because so much is at stake on this. Now, look, it was the last time we heard the science was settled was that there was a gay gene. Now, what we see coming out of this is there's a loose correlation. This is what the study found. There's a loose correlation between a number of genetic factors and same-sex behavior. Interestingly enough, it's a lower correlation than any sort of genetic causation for height. What's fascinating about that is there's about 60% of genetic reasoning Well, this explanation. I'm hearing the music here, Kirby. This explanation is going to take too long. We might want to come back to it here in just a second.
We'll come back to it, and that's a good cliffhanger. We'll be back with John Stonestreet right after this.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back for a few more minutes with John Stonestreet. And John, of course, the breaks wait for no one, including you and me. But let me just, before we let you answer your question, already getting some people saying, I can't find those videos. So go to whatyouSay.org. We'll try to put a link up there for it. We put a link up there to Breakpoint and a link to the Breakpoint commentary and everything else, but it's whatyouSay.org. And some of the videos, doesn't love make a family? Is sex assigned at birth? Does life begin at conception? And it'll be a new video each week. So again, we'll have that link up there. It's not there at the moment, but that's a good way to find it so that no one else calls in trying to figure out where to find those videos, which we've been promoting. But explain again this idea of the gay gene and how much genetics really affects sexuality. What would you say?
Yeah, well, thanks so much, Kirby, and thanks for that clarification on that. So the study was, again, headlined in so many different ways by so many different folks trying to push, kind of an agenda or a preconceived talking point. What the study actually demonstrated was, first of all, there is no gay gene. That's now definitive. Second, that there are genetic factors that correlate to same-sex activity. Now, as we all know, and this is the number one rule, correlation is not the same as causation.
Yeah.
So, yeah, that's right. And also the genetic correlation here is pretty modest. It's actually more modest than the genetic correlation when it comes to something like height. Now, here's why this is interesting. About 60% it's about 60% cause when it comes to our height are genetic factors. And that's what explains that there's also an environmental influence on our height. That's why, for example, children of immigrants are often taller than their parents. When they come to the United States, either it's, better hygiene, it's better health, it's better living situations, better nutrition. And so there's an environmental factor that even influences something that is as genetically determined as height. Well, that's 60%. We're somewhere between 8 and 20% based on this study of genetic correlation between these genetic factors and same-sex activity. So it's less than 20% at the best-case scenario. That means 80% of this is going to be at some level caused by environment. Now, the other thing we all need to know about this is no secret, okay? Even in the pro-LGBT movement, all the way dating back all the way back to 1989, leaders in the movement were admitting when it comes to sexual orientation, it is a matter of nature and nurture. And but at the time, and there's sources saying, but the born this way is a very effective talking point. It's a very effective cliche and slogan, born this way, so we're going to use it. And it's never been known to be true. And now we know definitively that the genetic factor is actually it's actually pretty thin. It's actually pretty small. And yet, what do the headlines say? You had these headline writers reporting on this study, tripping over themselves because they know the political and the cultural consequence of not, walking in step with the sexual revolution. And that's what's so sad about this is, again, we're playing games with children. We're playing games with human lives, and we're doing it when the science is pointing in the opposite direction.
Wow. Just before we run out of time, let's talk briefly about the issue of religious liberty. And you have a lot of our heroes there, Michael Ferris, Christian Wagner, and others that have been involved in this. And this has been significant as well. We recognized, and Chuck Colson recognized, and you and others have recognized there would be always this challenge between church and state. And if it weren't for the very significant changes in the federal judiciary because of the current president, I think we'd be a lot worse off. But there's still an incredible challenge before us in terms of religious liberty, isn't there?
No, there is, and we are grateful for the remaking of the judiciary. But Kerby, that's a Band-Aid on what I think is a gaping wound in America, which is, when the other big change since 2009, the last 10 years when the Manhattan Declaration was first put out, and this is huge. 10 years ago, religious liberty was a good thing. Everyone agreed it was a good thing. Like America, apple pie, baseball, it was just kind of part of who we are. Now, increasingly, religious liberty is seen as a bad thing. So the loss of the cultural imagination, not only into what religious liberty is, but the fact that it's actually a cultural good, that religious liberty enables and actually is a correlating factor to all kinds of other cultural goods. The fact that religious liberty is a protection of citizens from the big government, and so on. If you want to see people who understand that religious liberty is good, look at the Hong Kong protesters right now and compare that to what the Chinese are doing. Look, this is one of the big challenges we face, is that too many Christians in particular and too many Americans in general have lost an understanding of what religious liberty even is, and therefore the fact that it's actually a good thing. And America can't be America without it. And so that's why this section of the book to me is really important, because it makes a historical case for religious liberty, and it also makes a cultural case for religious liberty, that it's actually a good thing, not a bad thing.
And I think the other way to illustrate that is we have the Religious Freedom Restoration Act that was introduced by Congressman Chuck Schumer, a Democrat, in the House, and introduced by Ted Kennedy, a Democrat, in the Senate. And now, if you even propose something like the religious liberty ideas or the Religious Freedom Restoration Act, I think of the former governor of Indiana, who's now our vice president, you can be vilified. So it shows how quickly that has changed. Of course, the Boy Scouts and all sorts of other illustrations are there as well. But since we're almost out of time, let's again talk about some of the resources that are available through the Colson Center for Christian Worldview and through Breakpoint, because I want to once again point people to the excellent videos that are coming out. What would you say? And if somebody is not already signed up to receive the Breakpoint commentary, it is a must-read, I've always said, and there is a way in which as you go to breakpoint.org, just there, you can sign up to receive it and also find many of the other materials there because you have the Point and a variety of others. So talk about what is available to our listeners if they're not familiar with the Colson Center and Breakpoint.
Yeah, well, that's what we want to do. We want to help everyday Christians think about what's happening in culture from a Christian worldview. That's why I love what you do so much, Kerby, and so grateful for your support and all the things that you do. But breakpoint.org, you can click there on subscribe, and you can sign up to get the daily Breakpoint commentary through email. Or if you're a podcast person like I am, wherever you get podcasts, iTunes, Spotify, or whatever, you can just look up the Breakpoint podcast. And then these new videos, whatwouldyousay.org, whatwouldyousay.org, or you can also find it on YouTube. If you just Google What Would You Say, you get a Dave Matthews song. So you got to go whatwouldyousay.org, and you can subscribe there to also get notified each and every week. Every Wednesday, we'll be putting out a new video answering a tough question in a memorable, repeatable, shareable sort of way.
Well, so get Dave Matthews and we'll get the commentary. So we got it good. And again, we also have a link to the book because we spent some time talking about this, but I also wanted to cover it with all sorts of other great commentary. Again, one last time, Life, Marriage, and Religious Liberty, What Belongs to God, What Belongs to Caesar. It is written by both John Stonestreet and, of course, David Dockery's been on with us as well. All sorts of contributions from a variety of different individuals, including Timothy George, Robert George, Johnny Erickson Tata. The list goes on and on of our so many friends that have actually contributed to it, and I think you will benefit from that as well. We have a link to it on our website. You can get it both in hardcover and in Kindle, and it's a resource that I hope that you will take advantage of so that you can make the case for being salt and light in the culture. John Stonestreet, always a pleasure to have you on the program.
Thanks so much, Kerby. Appreciate what you do.
Want to thank Andrew and Steve for the help behind the scenes. Tomorrow, we're going to talk with Jim Dennison, and then we'll get into a couple of other really great interviews which we will be taking on, and so I hope that you will take the time to listen again. If you find yourself saying, I want to hear this interview again, the podcast is available, and all sorts of other great resources is all at pointofview.net. We'll see you back here tomorrow, right here on Point of View.
It is a horrible scenario, but it happens. Dennis writes about his wife who was diagnosed with leukemia. She's now a 2-time survivor. They ran up over $1 million in medical bills. Thankfully, they're Medishare members, and Dennis says they're so thankful for that, how people came together to meet their needs. Medishare works, and it could save you a lot of money. The typical family saves $500 a month. Find out more. Call 855-SHARE-40. That's 855-SHARE-40.
Every day we face new challenges. At the time of Jonah, the Bible says in Nineveh, they couldn't tell their right hand from their left. But in America today, a bunch of people can't tell men from women. In fact, some say men can be women. Christians are called to proclaim God's truth in every area of life. But who has time to study every crazy new thing the world can think of? I'm glad you asked. Get the information you need every day with Kerby's Viewpoints commentary. Sign up to receive them via email at pointofview.net/viewpoints or find them on the Point of View radio app. Viewpoints commentaries, making sense of the world around us. pointofview.net/viewpoints. Point of View is produced by Point of View Ministries.